Sapphistries by Leila Rupp, A Global History of Love Between Women, Chapter 8, In Public, 1920 to 1980. Imagine for a moment that you are in Berlin in the 1920s. After a devastating loss in the first near global war, followed by hyperinflation that had workers paid daily or even twice a day, in wheelbarrows full of soon to be worthless currency, in the midst of political violence between right and left, in the face of all this defeat and humiliation and turbulence, the culture of the new Weimar Republic has burst into bloom, perhaps only so vibrant because of the economic, political, and social turmoil. So you are in Berlin. It is nighttime and you are out on the town. You wander into one of the many clubs catering to gender ambiguity and sexual freedom. There are masculine women with feminine men with masculine men. The entertainment is risque. The atmosphere is a little seedy. Think cabaret. Numbers include Oh, Just Suppose and When the Special Girlfriend. The latter, a number performed by Marlene Dietrich in 1928. Both of these hint that a presumably straight woman might at any moment fall into each other's arms. At some point in the evening, a woman comes on stage. Here, definitely think Marlene Dietrich. And the song she sings stirs a response in the world weary crowd. It is the Lavender Song, Das Lila Lied, a rousing anthem of queer pride flaunted in the face of the rising Nazi threat. This is what sets your heart pounding. We're not afraid to be queer and different. If that means hell, well, hell will take that chance. They march in lockstep, we prefer to dance. We see a world of romance and of pleasure. All they can see is sheer banality. Lavender nights are our greatest treasure, where we can just be who we want to be. Round us all up, send us away. That's what you'd really like to do, but we're too strong, proud, unafraid. In fact, we almost pity you. You act from fear. Why should that be? What is it that you are frightened of? The way that we dress, the way that we meet, the fact that you cannot destroy our love? We're going to win our rights to lavender days and nights. This scene is a far cry from the mostly private interactions between women that we have encountered so far. As we have seen, the conceptions of sexologists as they spread from Germany around much of the globe made elements of an already existing world of same-sex desire non-public or more public. Schoolgirl crushes, traditionally either ignored or validated as innocent, came under new scrutiny. Explosions of creative energy and cultural movements, from the May 4th movement in China to the Salon of Nathalie Barney in Paris to the Harlem Renaissance in New York, publicized in the written word, in the visual arts, and in song the existence of women who loved women. And the flourishing of commercial entertainment in urban areas created spaces where women as well as men with same-sex desires could meet. But this is not simply a triumphal story of secret lives coming out into the light of day, for private connections remained important in the history of women who loved women. Lack of access to public space in many cultures meant that the new vibrant public worlds that flourished in some cities were only part of the global history. Schoolgirls in the news. In the early 20th century, the intimate friendship between girls in school, which had blossomed and seemed so admirable in many societies, suddenly found themselves in the harsh glare of sexological theory. Havelock Ellis, in his The School Friendships of Girls, an appendix to the third edition of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, published in 1920, warned about the dangers of the passionate relationships between girls in schools in Italy, England, the United States, and Latin America. Known as flamma, flame, in Italy, such a relationship was, according to Ellis, quote-unquote non-sexual, yet at the same time it had, quote, all the gradations of sexual sentiment, end quote. He quoted an informant for Italian researchers who described a flame relationship developing, quote, exactly like a love relationship. It often happens that one of the girls shows man-like characteristics, and the other lets herself be loved, end quote, as would a girl with her lover. Although such relationships involved passion and kissing and caresses, Ellis and his Italian source did not see them as homosexual, but rather a, quote, love fiction, a play of sexual love, end quote. In England, such relationships were known as raves or spoons, And Ellis quoted an Englishwoman who insisted that such passionate ties were, quote, far commoner than is generally supposed, end quote. Quote, from what I have been told by those who have experienced these raves, I have since been in love with men, and have since been in love with men, she told Ellis. The emotions called forth in both cases were similar, end quote. Students might have raves on teachers or on one another. In the case of two schoolgirls, quote, there is more likely to be a sexual element, great pleasure being taken in close contact with one another, and frequent kissing and hugging, end quote. But girls were so ignorant of sexuality that they did not recognize this activity as sexual. Ellis leaves judgment in the English case to his informant, who thought that if there was no actual sexual activity, then such relationships did more good than harm. For the United States, Ellis relied on answers to a questionnaire sent out by a professor at Clark University. He reports much of the same thing, that girls in school and young women in college are likely to fall in love with one another. One woman wrote about falling for another girl at 14 that, quote, it was insane, intense love, end quote, just like her first love for a man. In both cases, her, quote, whole being was lost, immersed in their existence, end quote. Girls from Buenos Aires, Ellis cited a researcher who found that a spoon as a schoolgirl left their classroom, quote, they were found in pairs or small groups in corners on benches beside the pillars, arm in arm or holding hands. They were sweethearts, talking about their affairs, end quote. One was active and the other was passive, expressing, quote, her affection with sweet words and promises of love and submission, end quote. But such relationships were so common in so many places, 60% of students according to the Italian researchers, Ellis seemingly could not wrap his head around the notion that they presented, quote, an absolute expression of real congenital perversion of the sex instinct, end quote, even though he admitted that, quote, there is an unquestionable sexual element, end quote. Yet it is clear from his descriptions that gender difference, masculinity, femininity, or in his terms, active and passive, sometimes entered into the picture, and that, however much he and his sources tried to deny it, sexual feelings, if not actual genital activity, played a part in the schoolgirl friendships. If Ellis agonized over what to make of passionate attachments among girls, over time such relationships did come to seem a sign of, quote, congenital perversion, end quote. In 1928, a 1928 novel about Vassar College, We Sing Diana, described a veritable sea change from the days in which the women's college was a breeding ground for the acceptable quote-unquote smashing. By 1920, a character in the novel noted, quote, intimacy between two girls was watched with keen, distrustful eyes. Among one's classmates, one looked for the bisexual type, the masculine girl searching for a feminine counterpart, or one ridiculed for their devotions, end quote. As the novel suggests, the language of sexology had in some places infiltrated the world in which young women fell head over heels in love with no self-consciousness. Attention to schoolgirl intimacy brought love between women into the public eye, not only in the United States, England, Western Europe, and Latin America, but especially in Japan and China, where girls' schools represented a relatively new development. In Japan, intimacy between women had never been roundly denounced by religious, medical, or legal authorities, but the spread of sexology changed all that. A 1911 newspaper article listed a whole slew of words referring to quote-unquote passionate love between classmates or to the young women themselves. Goshin-yu, intimate friends, ohaikara, stylish from the English term high collar, onetsu, fever or passion, ome, possibly a combination for the words male and female, and odeya, an honorific attached to the Japanese version of the English word dear. In the 1920s and 1930s, the term S from the English word sister had become publicly associated with both schoolgirls' attached to their friends and the friendships themselves. Girls' schools were elite institutions in Japanese society, which the references to English world confirmed. Connections to the raves and smashes and flames of young women's friendships in the Western world suggest a nascent cross-cultural schoolgirl culture. Some Japanese sexologists emphasize the romance rather than the sexuality of schoolgirl friendships, considering them a quote-unquote normal phase harmless quote unquote love play, a quote unquote preliminary step, or a quote unquote practice run for heterosexuality. Freud's theories of same sex attraction as a part of a normal sexual development influenced Japanese sexologists' thinking of this question. Such attachments might involve no more than kisses or caresses. In contrast to schoolboys who were assumed to have a stronger sexual drive that would result in anal intercourse, schoolgirls' same sex love was more quote unquote mysterious and quote unquote platonic. Researcher Yamamoto Senji criticized male teachers who saw in quote unquote platonic love among girl students who, quote, simply hugged each other without any carnal trick, end quote, the same kind of evidence as in boys' mutual masturbation and sodomy. Habuto Eiji, in 1921, described relationships in this way. As love between the female couple begins to heat up, their letters start to read like love notes, which they send under pseudonyms for no reason. They have their photographs taken often, they leave the house early, visit each other inordinately, and stroll hand in hand in parks and at shrine and at temple affairs. They exchange meaningful smiles on almost any occasion. Their conversations are invariably long, and they scribble their partner's name in their notebooks and books. Some feminists took up the defense of schoolgirl relationships by arguing that they were positive and spiritual rather than carnal, although other feminists denounced them as unwholesome. Furuya Tokoyo, a founder of a girls' school, published an article in a women's journal in 1923 titled The New Meaning of Same-Sex Love in Female Education. She differentiated same-sex love of a student for a teacher, which encouraged a girl to work hard and model herself on her beloved, or between students, which facilitated emotional development from quote-unquote sordid love between women in the past, referring to Buddhist nuns or ladies-in-waiting in women's quarters. In making that contrast, she denied any physical involvement through quote-unquote base passion on the part of schoolgirls. But some sexologists linked S ties directly to sexual perversion. At the outset of the 20th century, the Japanese sexologist Ishikawa Kiyotada thought that prostitutes were the main practitioners of female same-sex love, but by 1920, Sawada Junjiro gave the honor to students in girls' schools, although in addition he suspected it among factory workers, nurses, aristocratic ladies, unmarried daughters, married women, concubines, widows, prisoners, maids, sailgirls, clerical workers, teachers, actresses, geishas, prostitutes, and nuns, hardly a select list. Sexologists noted signs that ordinary school friendship might be developing into sexual perversion, following the example of an Italian psychologist and psychiatrist. But what were parents to make of the fact that friends choosing to wear their hair in the same style meant excessive affection, and if one bobbed her hair, they might be having sex? On the or that sexologist Sawada Junjiro assured them, quote, "These things are immediately visible to the eyes of those with experience, but to those with none they cannot easily be apprehended." End quote. Sawada, along with other sexologists, claimed to know something about the sexual practices of schoolgirls, including genital activity. He thought girls became increasingly sexual beginning at around age 15. Another sexologist reported a past incident in which graduates of a girls' school had drowned and their genitals were found to resemble those of prostitutes. And yet another sexologist announced that the renovation of a dormitory revealed a secret supply of dildos hidden away, presumably for the enjoyment of the girls together. Ironically, as schoolgirls replaced schoolboys as the main practitioners of quote-unquote same-sex love, they came to resemble them more in their presumed sexual practices. As with the case of Alice Mitchell's murder of her lover, Frida Ward, in Memphis, scandals resulting from the schoolgirl relationship alerted the public to what was going on and also served as quote-unquote evidence for the sexologists. We can see this dynamic in the case of the 1911 double suicide that gave rise to the sexologists' report on the state of the drowned girls' genitals. Sone Sadako and Ikamura Tameya, both 20 years old and graduates of a Tokyo girls' school, left their home, tied themselves together with a pink sash, weighed themselves down with stones, and threw themselves into the Sea of Japan. While at school, their classmates reported they were in a clear case of ome, and since graduation, they had seen each other daily. Perhaps unhappy that one of their fathers had tried to curtail their meetings and that Sone was to be married, they planned what was a traditional performance in Japan known as shinju, quote, what is in the heart, end quote. On their last voyage, they used the same family name, Tanaka, and signed a note they left, quote, 2 pine needles, end quote. Although female double suicides were not entirely novel in Japan, most were among factory workers, prostitutes, and maids, not well-educated elite young women. The press, including a women's magazine and widely read newspapers, reported avidly on the incident, bringing to public attention the phenomenon and vocabulary of schoolgirl friendships, sexological concept of perversion, and the notion of quote-unquote same-sex love. A masculine woman, Sakuma Hideka, who was thwarted in a suicide attempt with her feminine partner in 1924, told the press, quote, I don't hate men. I've just felt closer to women since graduating from girls' high school, end quote. At the height of the Great Depression in the early 1930s, female double suicides became a, quote, phenomenon of the age, end quote, according to sexologist Yasuda Tokutaro. One well-publicized case, although not involving schoolgirls, nevertheless called attention to what one account called the, quote, recent disturbing increase in lesbian affairs between upper-class girls and women, end quote. The star-crossed lovers, both in their 20s, were Saijo Eriko, who played a woman's part in the all-female Chochiku Revue, who were both masculine and feminine performers, inspired crushes in their fans, many of them girls in school, and Masuda Yasumare, an upper-class masculine fan who had taken a male name. Because Masuda had short hair, wore mannish dress, and sported round glasses, she bore the brunt of the negativity about their double suicide attempt. A national daily newspaper treated the incident in its humor column, and a ballad appeared with the title Suicide Journey of a Flapper and a Mannish Woman. The hostile publicity contrasted with the reverent treatment of heterosexual lovers who killed themselves rather than submit to arranged marriages to others. Saijo and Masuda met backstage in 1934, and Saijo admitted her account of the affair that she found the fan handsome and that the two began to see each other every day. Masuda wrote letters expressing her longing to spend every minute with Saijo, which the actress, no doubt disingenuously, reported that she wrote off as fan mail. The two took on an extended trip together, during which Masuda refused to return home, and Saijo, according to her account, began to tire of Masuda's intensity. After Masuda's mother tracked her down and took her home, she escaped the family home, quote, re-entering the fickle world of sexual desire, end quote, according to a press account. She went to Tokyo and called Saijo, who came to her hotel room accompanied by her father. She felt sorry for the distraught young woman and, making clear how differently their relationship could be viewed, urged Saijo to spend the night with her. Saijo's account makes no mention of the suicide pact and tranquilizers they took, as reported in the press, admitting only that she was surprised to wake in the morning. Masuda recovered, and her family allowed her to live independently, a privilege reserved for sons. Saijo left the Revue to pursue a career in film. In conjunction with the stories of schoolgirl romances, the attention accorded this case because of Masuda's class standing and Saijo's celebrity introduced the Japanese reading public to a world of same-sex love and sexual desire. In Japan, as everywhere, publicity about the schoolgirl lovers resulted from anxieties about social and economic change. In contrast to the idealized traditional Japanese wife and mother, the schoolgirl, and especially the masculine young women, represented the deleterious effects of westernization. Saito Shingeyoshi, a physician, insisted that mannish women were, quote, more prevalent in the West, end quote, and that other sexologists associated, quote unquote, permanent female homosexuality with the West, and the quote unquote transient variety with Japan. In fact, it would seem that fear about what was going on in the dormitories and halls of the girls' schools was a transnational phenomenon, as suggested by the popularity in Japan of Madchen in Uniform, a 1931 German film about sexual desires in girls' schools. As we have seen in so many other times and places, love between women carried all sorts of implications for the health and authenticity of a culture or nation. The debate about schoolgirls in Japan, as well as the writings of German and British sexologists, including Krafft Ebing and Ellis, had an impact in China as well. In 1911, a 1911 article in a women's journal, Funo Shibao Women's Times, titled The Same-Sex Erotic Love Between Women, described attempts to eliminate quote-unquote same-sex mutual love in Japan. Quote, to prevent this fashion by abolishing the dorms in women's schools or forbidding close female friends to sleep in the same room is easy to say but difficult to carry out, end quote. As in Japan, experts disagreed about the nature of girls' friendships, some emphasizing the emotional qualities and others worrying about perversion. In 1927, a Chinese translation of Ellis's The School Friendships of Girls appeared under the significantly altered title Same-Sex Love Among Female Students. Pan Guodong, who translated Ellis's The Psychology of Sex into Chinese in 1946, thought that the rise in coeducational schools had greatly limited same-sex love between male students, but that, quote, we can find many instances of same-sex love between female schoolmates. Some women even make a mutual agreement not to get married or to marry the same person in the future, end quote. See the representation of Chinese women's friendships in Figure 20. One of the ways that romance between girls at school came to public attention in China was through literature. As in Japan and elsewhere, education for girls beyond elementary school was a privilege of the Chinese elite in the early 20th century. Educated women struggled to free themselves from traditional roles as wives and mothers if they sought to pursue a career as a teacher, doctor, reformer, or writer. We have already encountered Lu Yin, whose story Li Shi's Diary depicted classmates in love. Another of her works, Old Acquaintances by the Seaside, imagines a community of women at college who long for a house by the sea where they can live and work together. But as they graduate, they marry and give up their dreams, and the protagonist, Lucia, is left depressed by the loss of a loving women's world. An alternative scenario to life after school appears in Summer Break by another May 4th writer, Ding Ling. In that story, two women teachers who had spent their days in school seeking girlfriends, sending love letters, kissing and embracing, find themselves uninterested in their chosen careers. Although they regret not marrying, they continue their same-sex romance, doing, quote, with each other whatever newlyweds do, end quote. In yet another example of May 4th fiction, Ling Shuhuao recast a story published by a male member of her circle. Both tales, written in 1926, tell of a relationship between two girls who play Romeo and Juliet in their school production. The original story, Why Did She Suddenly Go Crazy?, explains their quote-unquote same-sex love as a result of Romeo's masculinity and the lack of heterosexual opportunities. In Ling's version, with the intriguing title Humor Has It That Something Like This Happened, the two girls fall in love, embrace and kiss, and even share a bed in the dorm. Gu Yinmen, who plays Romeo, argues for the superiority of female same-sex love, pointing to the example of two of their teachers who lived together. Quote, why can't we follow their example, end quote, she asks Deng Yunlao, her Juliet. Quote, I believe my love for you is so much deeper and will last longer than any man's love for you. Can't you think of yourself as married to me, end quote? But Yunlao's family arranges a marriage for her, and although she cannot bear to lose Yingman, she feels she must obey. When Yingman learns that her love has married, she faints and sees a vision of Yunlao, but is unable to tell if she is calling for help or smiling. That schoolgirl romance was no well-kept and shameful secret, and suggested by Ji Binying's The Autobiography of a Woman Soldier, the tale of a schoolgirl turned soldier who fought to liberate the Chinese masses. In the 1920s, a women's college, Ji encountered the quote-unquote troubles of same-sex love, when 5 classmates fell in love with her and fought for her attention. Without embarrassment, Xi admitted to being, quote, born with a male personality, end quote, that attracted such attention. Her unself-consciousness about her past, even if suspended by heterosexual love and commitment to social revolution, makes clear how such stories of girls in love at school had filtered into public consciousness. Whether newly scrutinized from the perspective of sexology or accepted as a natural consequence of sex segregation, passionate relationships at girls' schools and women's colleges spread around the world about the possibilities of love between women. From the United States to Europe to China to Japan, the education of women opened up the possibility of a professional and personal life without marriage to a man. As the stories of Lu Yin and Dingling suggest, for at least some women, the relationships they formed in school had a lingering impact on the desires and ambitions. And the kind of community of women of which Lu Yin's heroine Lucia dreamed did, in fact, become a reality for some women in some places. An eye on the women's movement. The economical, social, and cultural developments that undergirded the emergence of communities of women in the early 20th century tended to facilitate a breakdown of barriers between women and men, making heterosocial and heterosexual interactions more public while casting increasing suspicion on homosexual ties or homosocial ties. Nowhere was this dynamic more in evidence than in feminist movements, where solidarity among women fostered not only intimate relationships but also anti-feminist attacks from the outside. Havelock Ellis blamed the women's movement for an increase in lesbianism by bringing more women into contact with quote-unquote congenital inverts in colleges, settlement houses, and political organizations, and other experts followed suit. The French sexologist Julien Chevalier thought that homosexuality was congenital, but also insisted that the number of lesbians was increasing as women became more emancipated. A U.S. doctor wrote in the New York Medical Journal in 1900 that, quote, the female possessed of masculine ideas of independence, the virago who would sit in the public highways and lift up her pseudo-virile voice, and that disgusting antisocial being, the female sexual pervert, are simply different degrees of the same class, degenerates, end quote. Following Havelock Ellis, Japanese physician Otsuka Shinzo denounced the quote-unquote new women of feminist circles as masculine quote-unquote perverts. Such attacks called attention to the bonds that women formed within the women's movement. In Japan, the feminist Blue Stalking Society, Saitosha, founded in 1911, attracted negative attention for allegedly fostering same-sex eroticism. Most members had graduated from the Japanese Women's College, founded in 1901, whose students the media denounced as, quote, sexual degenerates, end quote, from the outset. Newspapers in Tokyo reported in 1912 that members had gone to a brothel district, hired a geisha who had graduated from a girls' school, more of the schoolgirl taint, and spent the night with her in a tea house. One of the founders of the organization, Hiratsuke Raicho, formed an intimate relationship with a younger member, the artist Otake Kokichi, and wrote about their mutual affection in the organization's journal. Both women wore men's clothing and smoked and drank like men. They used the term shonen, literally boy, but in the slang of boys' schools, a term for the younger members of a male couple to describe Otake. She was indeed younger, tall, and unconventional in her dress, and moved and spoke in an unrestrained way, all of which evoked masculinity. The press reported that Hiratsuka was a bisexual and sex addict, and that Otake was a lesbian. When Hiratsuka wrote her autobiography in 1971, long after both women had entered into a relationship with men, she denied that her relationship with Otake had anything to do with quote-unquote same-sex love. Their subsequent passion for men she put forth as proof that there was nothing quote-unquote pathological about their relationship. The Blue Stalking Society, although together The Blue Stalking Society also brought together Tamura Toshiko, a novelist, and Nagunuma, later Takamura Chieko, an artist. Tamura was married but wrote about love between women. When Naganuma left her to marry a man, Tamura wrote in her novel Samuke Chills, quote, I would like to let this man have a modest wife, a lovely and obedient woman to live with him. However, every time this thought strikes me, I cannot help crying out. Every time I recall that we can live the women only life without a man, I feel so happy as though my body were sailing over the wide open sea. End quote. Tamura later expressed strong feelings for Higetsuka Raicho, but could not get around her masculinity. But the gender and sexual fluidity that marked members of the Blue Stalking Society brought into public a challenge to both the Japanese expectations that women would be, quote, good wives, wise mothers, end quote, and the pathologizing of relationships between women. The press pinned the label garusan from the French word for boy, garçon, on women considering quote unquote new, modern, and or Western. In China, too, the quote unquote new women of the May 4th movement negotiated between the modern emphasis on freer relations between women and men on the one hand, and bonds of solidarity between women on the other. Lu Yin, the author whose stories depicted girls wrenched apart in the interests of marriage, experienced her own conflict between her relationships with men and what literary scholar Ceylan Tsang perusively argues was Lu Yin's erotic attraction to women. This conflict played out on a trip to Japan with her second husband. Apparently freed, both by travel and her marriage, she admitted to a fascination with prostitution and a desire to visit a brothel. Quote, when I was still in China, I had often daydreamed about masquerading as a man so that I could visit a brothel to have a look at prostitutes' flirtatious smiles and luxurious, dissipated lives, end quote. This she never dared to do in China, out of fear that if she were discovered, quote, people might have a dreadful suspicion about her, end quote. But in Japan, she was an anonymous, so she dressed in Western clothes to pass herself off as a Japanese new woman and found a guide to take her and her husband to a district where lower-class prostitutes worked. She started out excited about the adventure, but ended up repulsed and afraid, both of the prostitutes and of the men who buy sex from them. Lu Yin's other experience of same-sex eroticism came in her first visit to a bathhouse, where she discovered that the Japanese were less modest than the Chinese and enjoyed communal bathing. Disrobing, she hurried into the bath and hid her body in the water. But after bathing and dressing, she began to look around in admiration at the women's bodies and beauty. Quote, the other women were lovely and languorous after their bath, and how natural they looked. Facing the glossy mirror, they combed their hair and applied powder and rouge to their faces, all the while without a stitch of clothing on. I feasted on the sight. I admired their bodies as I put on my socks. End quote. Lu Yin's fascination with the sexuality of the brothel, reminiscent of the Blue Stalking Society's night with the geisha, and her erotic attraction to the bodies of a Japanese women suggest that feminist concerns of the May 4th women's writers helped to make public the possibility of desires between women. In the Western world, relationships between feminist women were much more private and less ostracized in public, although sometimes just as controversial within the movement. In the United States, the lingering acceptance of romantic friendship shielded women who were prominent in the women's movement from suspicion of sexual deviance. The women's movement provided a comfortable space for women such as Anna Howard Shaw, a suffrage leader and a star orator of the movement, who fell in love with women throughout her life. Her long-term relationship with Lucy Anthony, suffrage great Susan B. Anthony's niece, was a marriage in which Anthony played wife to Shaw's husband. But Shaw also had flings with other women in her suffrage travels. Carrie Chapman Catt, Shaw's rival in the women's movement, responded to gossip about Shaw's advances by writing, quote, I think A.S. is too old for that sort of thing now. It used to happen often, about every 2 years, end quote. Catt herself, despite her 2 marriages, made life with another woman, Mary Garrett Hay, even before the death of her second husband. When another suffragist Mary Peck declared her declaration to Kat in the first decade of the 20th century. Kat warned her that Hayes, quote, affection, although never the A.S. Anna Shaw kind, is masculine as far as ownership goes, end quote. Shaw's grandmotherly persona and Kat's marital status protected them from external denunciation, although gossip about their intimate connections circulated within the women's movement. In other places, too, the women's movement provided a hospitable environment for women in relationships with other women. In 1904, in a speech to the pioneering German homosexual rights group, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, Anna Ruling commented that, quote, the homosexual woman is particularly capable of playing a leading role in the international women's rights movement for equality. And indeed, from the beginning of the women's movement until the present day, a significant number of homosexual women assumed the leadership in numerous struggles, end quote. She was probably referring to German couples Käthe Schringmacher and Clara Schlecker, and Anita Aussprung and Lida Gustava Heyman. We have already met Aussprung and Heyman boldly turning down proposals from neighboring Bavarian farmers. They were accepted as a couple in the German and transnational women's movement. When Heyman planned a trip to Geneva for a meeting in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in 1930, a staff member reported, quote, she is coming without Dr. Aussprung, which is scarcely believable, end quote. Colleagues noticed that they died within 2 weeks of each other, having been left homeless and without country as pacifists and feminists when Hitler came to power in 1933. Although such relationships, and this was true in the mid-20th century, were often accepted within the women's movement as life partnerships in the Boston marriage sense, Anna Ruling's speech makes clear that homosexuality was also a label that could be applied both within and outside the movement. Members of transnational women's organizations use terms such as queer, perverse from a sexual point of view, and manly looking to describe women, in one case commenting on a woman who, quote, went about together at The Hague, hair cropped short and rather mannish in dress, end quote. Doris Stevens, a U.S. militant feminist and early 20th century sex radical who took a sharp turn to the political right by the 1940s, referred in her diary to Alice Paul, founder of the U.S. National Women's Party, as a quote-unquote devotee of Lesbos, and thanked a friend for recognizing that, despite the fact she was a feminist, that she was, quote, not a queerie, end quote. So women's movements, along with girls' schools, both facilitated love between women and made that love visible. Some claim their love, or the love of other women, proudly. Some named it pathological. Some lived their lives in marriage-like relationships, blithely ignoring the new science of homosexuality. However, they responded, women in women's movements in places around the world helped make public the possibility of love between women long before the lesbian feminism in the 1970s and 1980s. Going public in private spaces. Outside the women's movement, education and increased access to employment in public spaces opened up other opportunities for women to forego a traditional home-centered life of marriage and childbearing. What was different by the early 20th century was the formation of communities of women, not just couples. Often these communities grew out of moments of intellectual or cultural ferment, as we have already seen in the case of the May 4th movement in China. Women writers, artists, musicians, and performers, like Charlotte Cushman before them, took advantage of progressive movements to lead unconventional lives. Through their lives, often still lived in private spaces, and their cultural products, they also helped bring love between women into the public eye. Perhaps the most famous community of women whose cultural productions publicized love between women gathered around Natalie Clifford Barney in Paris from the last decade of the 19th century into the mid-20th. Barney was an extremely wealthy and flamboyant American heiress who spoke and wrote French as if born to the tongue. When her parents' marriage fell apart, she and her sister and mother moved to Paris. Barney's mother, a bit of a free spirit herself, was an accomplished portrait painter whose later subjects included many of Barney's lovers, although she denied knowing about Natalie's nature until her published writing made it impossible to avoid. Barney made Paris her home until her death at the age of 95. It was there that she founded a salon that became the hallmark of elite and aristocratic lesbian life in the early 20th century. Protected by her wealth and influence, she rejected the negativity of the sexologists and, especially, the association of lesbianism with masculinity. Not only was she open about her love for women, as well as famous for her multiple conquests throughout her life, but she embraced both femininity and feminism. Djuna Barnes, like Barney, a lesbian American in Paris in the 1920s, described the heroine of the Ladies' Almanac, a modern Amazon modeled on Barney, as a famous woman, as a female who was, quote, developed in the womb of her most gentle mother to be a boy, end quote, but who, quote, came forth an inch or so less than this, yet paid no heed to the error, end quote. Barney had experienced same-sex desire at a young age, learning with something of a shock while she was still in her teens that others considered such taste perverted. She described her desires as entirely natural, or something, quote, naturally unnatural, end quote. Quote, I consider myself without shame. Albinos aren't reproached for having pink eyes and whitish hair. Why should society hold it against me for being a lesbian? It's a question of nature. My queerness isn't a vice, isn't deliberate, and harms no one. End quote. Barney's private yet public lesbian world had its origins in 1902 with the production of theatricals with and for a group of women friends. But when her experiences in both high society and the sexual underworld, she had an affair with the most famous courtesan in Paris, left her wanting more, she founded her salon. Quote, I therefore have to find or found a milieu. Sorry. Quote, I therefore have find. Oh my gosh. Quote, I therefore have to find or found a milieu that fits my aspirations, a society composed of all those who seek to focus and improve their lives through an art that can give them pure presence. End quote. She recollected at the end of her life about the decision to make art out of conversation. Both men and women gathered on Fridays for 2 months in the fall and 2 in the spring, from 1909 to 1968, interrupted only by the Second World War. To some of her events she invited only women, although she liked men and did not mind even if they came as voyeurs to watch women together. In 1927 she founded what she called the Académie des Femmes, intended as an alternative to the elite Académie Française, which did not admit women. There she honored women writers such as Gertrude Stein, with whom she became friends in the 1920s. As in all great salons, intelligent conversation amongst talented writers and artists was the order of the day. But what was special about Barney's salon was the prominence of lesbian and bisexual women. Many of them had lovers or ex-lovers. Many of them her lovers or ex-lovers. By the count of her longtime servant, Barney had more than 40 serious affairs and many more casual ones during her long life. Eventually, she formed a partnership with the painter Romain Brooks that lasted more than 45 years, although the relationship did nothing to slow down her conquests, causing Brooks much unhappiness. Perhaps nothing gives a better sense of the intimacy of Barney's salon, from both the creativity it nurtured and its legacy, than the number of novels in which a character is modeled on Barney. In Liane de Pouilly's Idelle Saphique, written by the former courtesan whom Barney seduced and attempted to save, Barney appears as Emily Florence Temple Branford, watching Sarah Branhart play Hamlet and raging against the tyranny of men. The actress and writer Colette, briefly Barney's lover and long a member of her circle, used the name by which Barney courted de Pouilly as her Natalie character in her novel Claudine S'en Va. Renee Vivian, one of Barney's serious lovers, who died young of anorexia and alcoholism, presented Natalie as Valley in Une femme m'a paru, a woman appeared to me. Valley asserts that, quote, to be as different as possible from Natalie in the true function of art, end quote. See figure 21 for a portrait of the famous Vivian and Barney. And there were others. F. Scott Fitzgerald, no admirer of lesbians or feminism, depicted Barney in Tender as the Night as someone whom his hero, Dick Diver, had to go see because she wanted to buy some pictures from a friend of his who needed the money. Quote, "You're not going to like these people," end quote, he warned Rosemary, the young American friend falling in love with him. And inside, Rosemary is besieged by a, quote, "neat, slick girl with a lovely boy's face," end quote, until drawn into conversation with the quote unquote hostess, quote, "another tall, rich American girl promenading insouciantly upon the national propensity," end quote. But no doubt, Natalie Barney's most famous literary incarnation is in Valerie Seymour is as Valerie Seymour in Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness. When Stephen Gordon is taken to her salon, she describes Valerie, quote, "Her face was humongous, placid, and worldly, her eyes very kind, very blue, very lustrous. She was dressed all in white, and a large white foxskin was clasped around her slender and shapely shoulders. For the rest, she had masses of thick, fair hair, which was busily riding itself up in hairpins. One could see at a glance she hated restraint." End quote. At first, Stefan is angry, thinking that Valerie approves of her solely because she is a lesbian, but then Valerie smiles at her and begins to talk about works, books, and life. Then, quote, Stefan began to understand better the charm that many had found in this woman, a charm that lay less in physical attraction than in a great courtesy and understanding, a great will to please, a great impulse towards beauty in all its forms. And as they talked on, it dawned upon Stefan that here was no mere libertine in love's garden, but rather a creature born out of her epoch, a pagan chained to an age that was Christian. End quote. And, in fact, Barney took on the name Amazon bestowed on her by Remy de Gourmont, a major French intellectual who became Barney's good friend despite or because of the fact that he fell hopelessly in love with her. When he published a series of letters, later a book called Lettres de l'Amazone, her fame spread. Her mother wrote to her, quote, "Tell me, my dear child, what did you do since you've known this old gentleman to be talked about this way all over Europe," end quote. Barney took up the challenge, publishing Thoughts of an Amazon, and then more Thoughts of an Amazon to change in the article telling. Barney and her circle also claimed a history connecting them to Sappho. A hostile review of Barney's first book, responding to poems extolling the beauty of women, took the title Sappho Sings in Washington, suggesting how readily the comparison between contemporary lesbianism and Sappho came to mind. Barney and Renee Vivian learned Greek in order to read the fragments in the original, visited Lesbos, where Vivian kept a villa, and sought out Pierre Louis, another author of Les Chansons de Bilitis, Songs of Bilitis, billed as love poems written by one of Sappho's lovers. Louis took a shrine to Barney and gave her and Vivian autographed copies of his book. Vivian evoked Sappho in her writing, in one poem imagining herself as one of Sappho's lovers and also as a Sappho to future generations of women. Barney associated her own regular infidelities with Sappho, much to Vivian's chagrin. Sappho was a favorite subject for Barney's theatricals. In one, she, like Erica Jong so long after her, changed the story of Sappho's suicide, but in this case, Sappho leapt into the sea for the love of a woman. The fascination with Sappho suggests not only a longing for a history of women who loved women, but also a recognition of the importance of a community. Natalie Barney's private world made public through odious self-preservation and immortalization in literature represents an important development in the early 20th century. Although her salon was a place for elite and often expatriated women to gather, its longevity and fame made it emblematic of the new spaces where desired women could gather without shame. Going out. More public and more accessible spaces for women to meet women emerged in the big cities of, of the industrialized world in the early 20th century, perhaps reaching their zenith in Berlin in the 1920s and early 1930s. Places to go out were not entirely new. By the mid 19th century in Paris, women seeking women found public places to meet, and in the 1880s and 1890s, according to a U.S. physician, quote, perverts of both sexes maintained a sort of social setup in New York City, had their places of meeting, end quote, including beer gardens and dance halls. In contrast to male fairies, however, the women, as quote, mannishly dressed as the styles of the time would permit, end quote, were not as flamboyant in public. By the 1920s, some of the urban areas throughout Eastern Europe and the United States spawned commercial establishments catering to women who desired women. In London, an observer in 1922 described the Café Royal as a place where, quote, things in women's clothes slide cunningly upon other women. Things in women's clothes slide cunning eyes upon other women, end quote, and, quote, hard-featured ambassadors from Lesbos, end quote, gathered. In Soho and the West End, Radcliffe Hall and other wealthy lesbians, along with gay men, frequented the kind of bohemian and artistic clubs that would be found in Greenwich Village. Yet London was still a place where, in part because of the latest fashions for young new women in the 1920s, were decidedly masculine, lesbians were both visible and invisible, at least until after the trial of the well-willingness. And there was no public lesbian culture compared to that of Paris and Berlin. In fact, Radcliffe Hall had her heroine do the nightlife in Paris, and one real-life British lesbian booked a trip to Paris with the intention of finding a lesbian club. When she finally found her way to Le Monaco, one of the first lesbian nightclubs, she remembered, quote, well, it was a wonderland. In my wildest imagination, I didn't know such a thing existed, end quote. The mother of a masculine lesbian daughter, who was friends with Radcliffe Hall, could still insist that lesbianism, quote, can carry on in Paris, but certainly not not here, end quote. So the delightful scene in Sarah Waters' picaresque 1998 lesbian novel, Tipping the Velvet, portraying a basement, quote-unquote, ladies' room in the 1890s where toms gather along with gay girls, that is, prostitutes, who giggle about tipping the velvet with one another for the pleasure of paying male customers, is pure fiction. But in Paris, Berlin, and New York, curious heterosexual tourists and people seeking adventure mixed with lesbians and gay men in a variety of clubs and bars, further increasing the visibility of enclaves of women, variously known as lesbians, girlfriends, or in African American communities, bulldaggers, lady lovers, and studs. In Paris, known in some circles as Paris Lesbos, prostitutes or showgirls made up the main clientele in public lesbian spaces. The table d'hôte of Louis Talandier, a madam, attracted the attention of Émile Zola in the course of research for his Émile Zola in the course of his research for his novel Nana. His notes transferred into the novel into a description of a lesbian restaurant called Chez Laure provide an image of the place. Quote, in couples, the women, all of them kiss, Louis on the mouth. The girls dressed as men, the maids skinny, infirm dyke. End quote. Talandier's place, like another lesbian restaurant in the 1890s, appeared in a guidebook as the pleasures of Paris, attracting voyeurs as well as the desired clientele. A music hall drag queen described pretty young women in the front rows of the music halls as, quote, almost always 2x2, belonging to that immense sect whose gracious priestesses served at the altar of Sappho. They were the principal triads of Paris, end quote. After the First World War, lesbians gathered in bars and cafes, as well as sometimes mingling with artists and bohemians. At La Monaco, women who bobbed their hair dressed in tuxedos. Other public spaces open to lesbians included fancy transvestite balls on holidays, brothels that attracted elite women clientele, certain baths and swimming pools, and even the city boulevards. Natalie Barney, it should be noted, courted the courtesan Lisiane de Pouilly in the street and in the brothel. So not only did lesbians in Paris move in to public spaces, but literary and artistic productions introduced them to a broader public. Not every lesbian who had access to public places by virtue of life in the city and disposable income found themselves welcoming. Both Natalie Barney and her lover, Dejuna Barnes, found the lesbian bars repugnant. Returning to Radcliffe Hall, who based a scene in her novel on a real outing in Paris in 1926, we find Valerie Seymour accompanying Stephen's new love, Mary, and a few others on an evening on the town in Montmartre. Um, Hall makes her own viewpoint clear as she describes, quote, the garish and tragic nightlife of Paris that lies open to such people as Stephen Gordon, end quote. Valerie, like her real-life counterpart, thinks, quote, the whole world has grown very ugly, but no doubt to some people this represents pleasure, end quote. Moving from cafe to cafe, the women drink, smoke, dance, and kiss. When Stefan and Mary get home early in the morning, and Stefan proclaims it was an awful night, Mary responds, quote, well, at least we could dance together without being thought freaks. There was something in that, end quote. However sleazy the clubs, there was always that to be said for them. As the image of the Lavender Song was performed in a cabaret makes clear, Berlin was also home in the 1920s to an amazingly vibrant public lesbian world. Even before the First World War, a tabloid paper, Great Bell, published from 1906 to 1922, called attention to communities of female homosexuals through its salacious attacks. A 1908 article described a quote-unquote sickening orgy among 7 women, complete with smoking and drinking, discovered by a shocked landlady investigating the noise. One of the women named in the article responded not by denying that they were homosexual, but by insisting that they had behaved respectably. The next year, the paper reported on a, quote, new women's community, end quote, describing the president of the club as an, quote, Amazon who lives together with a girlfriend and has a somewhat extravagant taste for appearing in an elegant men's evening suit, end quote, and the club's activities as involving effusive caresses. 5 members of the club affronted by the story, which included the charge that one member allowed another to seduce her teenage daughter, sued the editor. A mainstream Berlin paper picked up on the story, noting that Sappho and Aphrodite served as passwords for club members. In court, members admitted that they were homosexual, but denied the charges of immorality. They lost. In 1910, Grossklock reported on an even more public presence of lesbians, with a story about the Bavarian quarter, quote, gradually becoming a ghetto for homosexual women, end quote. They wore men's clothes, met during the day, talked openly in streetcars, and confused children who did not know that they were women if they were women or men. What especially disgusted the editor of the newspaper was the public visibility of women who desired women. After the war, and until the Nazis' rise to power, a large number of lesbian clubs, bars, balls, groups, circles, and publications catered to women who desired women, and cabaret acts openly represented lesbian love, marking Berlin as what one participant called the lesbian El Dorado. See Figure 22 for a photograph of women in Berlin club in 1922. A 1929 book, Berlin's Berlin's Lesbian Women, with a preface by Magnus Hirschfeld, listed 14 bars and clubs specifically marketed to women. Another guidebook, published the next year, described the class-differentiated clientele populating a wide variety of places. In Café Domino, the women were tasteful and elegant, whereas in Taverne, the atmosphere was rough and raunchy. At some clubs, such as Café Princesa, lesbian savings clubs, lottery clubs, or clubs devoted to card games met. Chez Ma Belle-Sœur, with frescoes of Lesbos, attracted mostly curious foreigners. Top and El Dorado were places to be seen. Claire Waldorf, a lesbian cabaret artist, described in her memoir a night out at a lesbian club. A fascinating mixture of women populated the club. Painters, models, elegant women eager to learn about the Berlin underworld, white-collar workers in love. Four musicians played wind instruments. Women danced. Petty jealousies erupted. Quote, "It was typical Berlin nightlife with its transgressions and color." End quote. Another participant remembered, quote, "a feeling of freedom. At the time it was chic to oppose the moral pressure of the empire. It was chic to be gay or to act as if you were." End quote. Others, echoing the fictional Valerie Seymour, recall the bars and clubs as depressing and more hidden from public view. All of this came to an end, of course, when the Nazis came to power. In Berlin, the authorities closed down homosexual bars, organizations, and publications. Lesbians, declared quote-unquote sexually decadent women, along with emancipated women and feminists, symbolized everything the Nazis thought was wrong with the modern world. Although Hitler's government never revised paragraph 175, the law that outlawed homosexuality to include women, that did not mean that lesbians lived under the radar. One Nazi lawyer called for the inclusion of lesbian women under the law, calling it incomprehensible that, quote, same-sex intercourse between women, tribadism, was not against the law, end quote. But the Nazis did not bother to criminalize lesbianism, and most lesbians who were sent to concentration camps, if they were not Jewish or socialists, wore black triangles denoting them as quote-unquote asocial, a vague term that covered many bases. Some lesbians accused of quote-unquote moral weakness for their desires or gender nonconformity ended up in other kinds of institutions, subjected to draconian conditions and sometimes sterilization. Lesbian culture did not die out entirely, but how thoroughly the Nazis destroyed such an elaborate public lesbian culture is a sobering corrective to notions of inexorable progress. The lesbian world of Weimar Berlin, because of the pioneering nature of German sexology and the vibrancy of Weimar culture in general, was extraordinary in its commercial venues. In addition to public places, periodicals sold on the streets and through the mail, literature and art introduced the world to a wide range of women who loved women. How advanced this world was suggested by a letter from Cecilia F. in Brooklyn to a lesbian periodical penned in 1927. Quote, "In the land of the free, people are inexpressibly prudish about sexual matters. We are made out to be degenerate, lascivious, and disreputable. No association or friendship federation of any kind exists here. America is 50 years behind Germany." End quote. Yet New York, too, was home to commercial and private venues that catered to a crowd with same-sex desires, and not just elite women. By the 1920s, both Greenwich Village and Harlem had established reputations as welcoming places for lesbians as well as gay men. Like Paris and Berlin, both neighborhoods were also artistic and bohemian centers. In the 1920s and 1930s, Greenwich Village morphed into a primarily Italian immigrant neighborhood, or morphed from a primarily Italian immigrant neighborhood to a bohemian enclave. Lesbians and gay men found tolerance in an unconventional environment, and the village gained a reputation as the home of quote-unquote long-haired men and quote-unquote short-haired women. A Vice investigator in 1919 commented that Greenwich Village places attracted, quote, all sorts of people, many obviously prostitutes and perverts, especially the latter, end quote. As the study published in 1930 put it, quote, "The village became noted as the home of pansies and lesbians, and dives of all sorts featured this type," end quote. Restaurants, speakeasies, tea rooms, and clubs sprang up all around the village. some sponsoring poetry readings, musical performances, and discussion groups. An article in the magazine Variety in 1925 listed 20 establishments that catered to the quote unquote temperamental set, meaning quote unquote fairies and quote unquote lady lovers. Their residents mixed with tourists, some of them seeking the gay life themselves. One lesbian proprietor, a Polish Jewish immigrant named Eva Kochever, who took the name Eva Adams, opened the Black Rabbit, a tea room that sported a sign on the door reading, quote, "Men are admitted but not welcome," end quote. A local village paper described the place as one where, quote, "ladies prefer each other," end quote. Called the Queen of the Third Sex or a man-hater by the press, Adams was arrested after a police raid and deported for having written a quote unquote obscene book called Lesbian Love. She reportedly later opened a lesbian club in Paris. Harlem, too, especially at the height of the Harlem Renaissance from the 1920s to the mid 1930s, was home to a lively nightlife, including speakeasies and a wide variety of clubs catering to women with same sex desires. Gladys Bentley, a masculine cross dressed black singer of suggestive songs who sported a white tuxedo and top hat, performed regularly at Harry Hensbury's Clam House. See her famous photograph in Figure 23. As in Paris, show business fostered a culture open to same sex sexuality. Costume balls attracted thousands of attendees, many of them men in drag, as well as voyeurs eager to see what was going on. White lesbian socialite Mercedes de Acosta remembered that people, quote, rushed up to Harlem at night to sit around the place, thick with smoke and the smell of bad gin, where N-words danced about with each other until the small hours of the morning, end quote. In addition to clubs where class and racially mixed audiences could dance, drink, and listen to jazz and the blues, semi-private parties brought together lesbians and gay men in Harlem. Alalia Walker, daughter of Madame C.J. Walker, who made a fortune marketing hair straightening products, hosted a salon and threw lavish parties at her home with her female lovers in attendance. Mabel Hampton, a black performer who in her teens lived in Harlem, described parties where women who desired women could meet. Quote, "The Bull Dykers used to come and bring their women with them, you know," end quote. Although hosted in private residences, rent parties, where guests paid admission to help out the host with his or her monthly obligations, were open to the public and could last all night long. A Harlem newspaper in 1926 told the story of a rent party gone wrong, when, quote, "one jealous woman cut the throat of another because the two were rivals for the affection of a third woman," end quote. In 1928, a Vice investigator attended a quote unquote women's party in Harlem, noting that, quote, "the women were dancing with one another and going through the motions of copulation," end quote. When he asked one of the women whether she was normal, she replied forthrightly, quote, "everybody here is a bull, dagger, or faggot, and I am here," end quote. As in Paris, Berlin, and Greenwich Village, the artistic flowering of the Harlem Renaissance spread word of lesbian love through literature, art, and music. Bessie Smith sang of a quote unquote mannish acting woman. Lucille Bogan of BD, Bulldagger Women, who, quote, "who drink up many a whiskey," end quote, and sure can strut her stuff. George Hanna's lyrics advised, quote, "when you see two women walking hand in hand, just shake your head and try to understand," end quote. Ma Rainey, who was married but had women lovers in, quote, "Prove It to Me Blues," end quote, admitted to her masculine dress and female companionship while challenging her listeners to, quote, "prove it to her." Even if these references were not always laudatory, they made women's same-sex desires and gender transgressions visible, and in fact many of the great women's blues singers were themselves lesbians or bisexuals. In the early 1930s, the Great Depression had dimmed the glamour and the wildness of Harlem and the village, just as the Nazi rise to power shut down the nightlife in Berlin. But places for lesbians to go did not disappear altogether. One woman remembered in the 1930s and 1940s, quote, "Many places in Harlem run by and for black lesbians and gay men when we were still bulldaggers and faggots and only whites were lesbians and homosexuals," end quote. In San Francisco, Mona's, the first lesbian nightclub in the city, opened in 1934, followed by a string of other clubs that catered to lesbians, gay men, and tourists together. A tourist guidebook, Where to Sin in San Francisco, noted at noted that at Mona's, quote, the little girl waitresses look like boys, and many of the little girl customers look like boys, end quote. In the 1940s, Gladys Bentley headlined at Mona's, along with other performers of color, including the Latin star Tina Rubio. Even in places as remote from urban gay life as Oklahoma City, there were places in the 1930s where women seeking women could find one another among the gamblers, prostitutes, and bootleggers. The outbreak of a new global war closed commercial establishments across Europe at the same time that it facilitated, in Europe and the United States, women's same sex connections in the military in semi-militarized institutions, including, ironically, the Women's Labor Service in Nazi Germany, and in war industries. In countries at war, the kind of sex segregated spaces that had long fostered love between women proved fertile ground once again. And through it all, where possible, lesbian commercial establishments survived. In cities across the United States, the 1940s and 1950s proved to be the heyday of a hard-working lesbian bar culture, of a working-class lesbian bar culture. The war had loosened social conventions, allowing women to wear pants in public, walk the streets without male escorts, and go to bars and clubs. The lesbian bar culture was primarily a white working-class world, although throughout the 1950s women of color began to feel more welcome in white bars and to establish their own places, while middle-class white women became less afraid of the bars, diversifying the crowds out in public. In Buffalo, New York, one patron remembers a 1940s gay and lesbian bar, Ralph Martin's, as fabulous and hopping on the weekends, with dancing and drag shows. In the 1950s, lesbians traveled from Niagara Falls, Rochester, and Toronto to a variety of Buffalo bars, most located near one another, and some of them very rough places where prostitutes, johns, and pimps mixed with the lesbians. Bars catering to lesbians also opened in the black section of Buffalo. In Detroit, the Sweetheart Bar welcomed straight people from the neighborhood along with lesbians and gay men, all in separate sections of the establishment. Fred's Bar, also in Detroit, opened in 1952, and with its location closer to the suburbs, its size and cleanliness, and its lesbian-only policy, it attracted middle-class lesbians. Lesbian bars provided the women who patronized them with friends, lovers, acceptance, and a place to gather in public, if not quite as visibly as in the clubs of Berlin in earlier decades. See Figure 24 for a photograph of butches and femmes in a U.S. bar. In Canadian cities, too, a lesbian bar culture emerged in the 1950s. In Toronto, uptowners who lived in the suburbs held pink or white-collar jobs and lived a double life, keeping their homosexuality secret, mixed with downtowners whose lives centered at the bar and who lived what they called the quote-unquote gay life. But in contrast to the patrons of the lesbian bars and other places, downtowners in the public houses of Toronto welcomed straight men as potential johns, buyers of drinks, or people they could pickpocket. Continuing the earlier connection between sex work and same-sex sexuality, some femmes and butches would have sex with men for money. And in the mid-1950s, the lesbian scene shifted to Toronto's Chinatown, the center of the sex trade. The quote-unquote sapphic set, including black as well as white Canadians, and they mixed with Chinese sex workers. The French bars in Montreal, with a reputation as rough and dangerous, had the same kind of connections to the criminal and sexual underworld. In Pont de Paris, lesbian, gay men, heterosexual couples, and single men would be directed to their own sections by the doorman as he sized them up. A lesbian bar culture also developed across the Atlantic in Brighton, Manchester, and especially London in the 1940s and 50s. The center of this public world in London was the Gateways Club in Chelsea, which opened in 1931 as a bohemian place that attracted artists, actors, musicians, and lesbians and gay men. The club was in a dark, dimly lit, smoky basement with room for about 200 people. The Gateways was not the only place that lesbians could go, but the other clubs were seedier and more part of the sexual and criminal underworld. Chelsea was, like Greenwich Village, a haven for the unconventional, including women who desired women. The Gateways got around restrictive licensing laws by functioning as a membership club, and word of mouth served as a means of recruitment. By 1966, it had thousands of members. It had become less elite and more lesbian after the Second World War, attracting working class women, women in the military, prostitutes, and black men and women. One young couple found out about it in 1947 when an elderly man approached them on the street and asked if they had ever been there. They said no and asked what it was, and he replied, quote, "It's a club you two girls might like. You two are very, very fond of each other, aren't you? Well, you will find other people down there who are very fond of each other." End quote. Across the Euro-American world, the bar and club culture developed clear norms and modes of dress and behavior, emphasizing the tradition of earlier lesbian culture, butch, or the preferred African American term stud, masculinity, and femme, femininity. At the Paper Doll in San Francisco, a tourist review advised that one could, quote, "see gay women who walk and talk like men, and often you'll find it hard to tell whether a gay woman is a woman because sometimes gay woman her hair cuts her hair like a man's and puts it on men's clothing and looks more like a gay man than a gay woman." End quote. In Montreal, some butches claimed the masculine article un butch and pronoun il and would be addressed as Mr. Monsieur. By the 1950s, a quote-unquote tough butch in Buffalo, like the downtowners in Toronto, dressed in typical working-class male attire as much of the time as possible and frequented the bar every night of the week, setting herself apart from the respectable middle-class society and declaring her erotic interests in public. At the getaways, too, butches wore, quote, "short or casual sweaters, trousers, and jackets, and the femme always wore skirts, blouses, high-heeled shoes, always carried a handbag, earrings, makeup, so you never had any problem in those days because you always knew who to ask for a dance." End quote. Butch and femme roles structured intimate relationships between them, anointing the butch as the doer who gave sexual satisfaction to the femme. Carried to its furthest point, this sexual system produced the idea of the untouchable or stone butch who, like Ann Lister, did not want a lover to make love to her. Quote, "If I could give her satisfaction to the highest, that's what gave me satisfaction," end quote, as one self-identified stone butch put it. As Joan Nessel, who came out as a femme in the 1950s, insisted, quote, "We knew what we wanted, and that was no mean feat for young women in the 1950s, a time when the need for conformity, marriage, and babies was being trumpeted at us by the government's policymakers." End quote. Butch and femme ways of being challenged mainstream gender roles and created a core identity, even if it was one that changed over time. In the bar culture of the 1940s, in Buffalo, butches were gay because of their masculinity and sexual desire for women, whereas femmes often saw their only difference from heterosexual women as their association with butches. So femmes were not necessarily quote unquote lesbians. One British woman, newly married and visiting the United States with her husband, fell in love with an American woman she met. Quote, "I didn't see myself as a lesbian or her because it didn't look as I imagined they all did, nor did she. I got the image from the well of loneliness like we all did." End quote. Another British woman has no memory of quote, words being used. In fact, I'm not sure they were. I don't think they were because gay hadn't been invented. Homosexual was a thing in books. Lesbian was like a derogatory term that you hardly ever heard. I think there was just an expectation that there were people like us and there were other people. End quote. As a Buffalo Butch woman who came out in 1957 while she was still underage put it, quote, I knew before I put a concept or a word to it that I was gay. End quote. Women in the lesbian bar culture made same-sex love and desire publicly visible, and in that way they engaged in a form of everyday resistance. Not only did butch femme couples affirm women's autonomous sexuality to people who passed them on the street or viewed them in bars, but butches stood up for and even physically fought the straight men, sometimes Johns interested in femmes who turned tricks for their right to the quote-unquote their femmes and to public spaces. One London butch remembers her reaction to being stared at on the tube. She referred She turned to the offender and said, quote, what are you fucking looking at? Is there something funny about us? What a statement, because there was. I was 5'2", flat chested, dressed as a bloke, standing on my toes trying to hang on this strap I could hardly reach. There were these women all glammed up, hanging on to us. Nobody ever dared say anything back. End quote. A Toronto butch announced that living openly was, quote, an indication of pride in the homosexual way of life, end quote. Although femmes could pass more easily, butch femme couples on the streets embodied, quote unquote, sexual courage in making visible their erotic desires. Men who frequented the bars and clubs asserted how important those places were in affirming their desires and identities. As one Buffalo woman put it, remembering a friend's first visit to a bar, quote, and she said, oh, I'm home. God, what a homecoming this was, end quote. Like a home, the Palais, 1940s Detroit, in 1940s Detroit, hosted birthday parties, lesbian weddings, and even baby showers. Lesbian weddings, with femme in wedding gown and butch in tuxedo, took place in bars in various cities in North America, including Toronto in the 1950s, where the tabloid newspapers got wind of the practice. The Gateway's regulars, whether they were living a double life, hiding their sexuality most of the time or not, the club became a lifeline. Quote, the Gates was like an oasis in a hostile world, end quote, one woman insisted. Quote, the Gateways was a world of its own where you could go and be yourself, end quote, another remembered. Quote, it was like my life's blood at the time. You didn't have to explain yourself. They knew what you were, end quote. Another regular reported, quote, because it was so difficult for me to be who I was within my own family, the women I got to know in the Gates became my family, end quote. Mary McIntosh, who wrote one of the earliest classic articles about homosexual identity, quote, just loved being at the Gateways. It gave me a huge buzz to be there when it was crowded and there was just a sea of women like us, end quote. In the United States, Canada, and England, lesbian commercial establishments not only gave women who desired women a place to go, but also attracted public attention. The police periodically raided establishments or revoked their licenses to sell alcohol. In 1954 in San Francisco, an investigation of a group of high school girls who, quote unquote, donned mannish clothes led to a bar raid. A police officer explained that, quote, the girls admitted frequenting a gay bar, one catering to sexual deviants. It started as a lark. Then some of the girls began wearing mannish clothing. We found that the activity was centering on Tommy's place, end quote. In Buffalo, crackdowns by the state liquor authority led to the closing of bars in the 1960s. The Carousel lost its license for being, quote, frequented by homosexuals and degenerates, end quote. A Gateway regular remembered the police coming in, looking for drugs and announcing, quote, fellows on one side, ladies on the other, end quote. Sensational newspaper reports of bar raids both fed into the negative public perception of homosexual life fostered by McCarthyism McCarthyite attacks in the United States and spread word among those who were interested that there were places to go. Lesbian bars also played a starring role in the lesbian pulp novels that flourished in the United States in the 1950s and were exported to the United Kingdom. Even The Well of Loneliness appeared with a pulp cover, see figure 25. An English woman touring in the United States noticed such books. Quote, they were in the drugstores around the states. These pulp books, lurid stories about lesbians who smoked cigars and had orgies with young girls, end quote. Most were penned by male authors for men's titillation, but some lesbian authors, constrained as they were by the publisher's requirements of unhappy endings as a way to evade censorship, still managed to advertise the joys of lesbian bars. Lesbian pulp novelist Anne Bannon is in one of her series of stories about a young woman who moved to Greenwich Village from the country, takes her heroine to a lesbian bar for the first time. She enters a, quote, basement bar, saturated with pink light, paneled with mirrors, and filled with girls. More girls, more sizes, types, and ages than Bebo had ever seen collected together in one place. For the first time in her life, she was proud of her size, proud of her strength, even proud of her oddly boyish face. She could see interest, even admiration, on the faces of many girls. It exhilarated her. End quote. In 1968, The Gateways transformed its semi-secret existence by appearing in the film The Killing of Sister George, with its regulars as extras. The lesbian main characters descend the steps of the club where women dance cheek to cheek. It was a spectacular coming out for both the club and the women who agreed to be filmed. And then, in 1979, a lesbian feminist magazine, Saijo, featured a cover with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher appealing to the primly dressed queen, let's go to the gates. See figure 26. By then, the lesbian world had changed dramatically, and the rise of the women's and gay liberation movements. And despite the tension between the world of butch femme bars and clubs and new lesbian feminist ideology and style, the sexual courage and everyday resistance of women who announce their identities and desires in public cannot be overlooked as an important force in the struggle for equality and acceptance. From the heady years of the 1920s through the 1950s, lesbian culture took on a more public face than ever before in big cities of the industrialized world. Not until later, as far as we know, did lesbians' commercial establishments open up in other parts of the world. A short story by Dale Gunthrop about her life in Johannesburg, South Africa in the 1960s, when women were not allowed in bars, described a place where, because of apartheid, quote, only the ponsiest of African queens, only the butchest of Indian dykes could appear, end quote. The first lesbian space in São Paulo, Brazil, emerged when lesbians took over a restaurant in the 1970s. The anonymity of urban life, the movement of women in the labor force, the proliferation of commercialized entertainment, and the openness fostered by cultural flowering made public lesbian spaces possible. Literature, art, and music, perhaps most spectacularly Radcliffe Hall's novel, introduced the public to lesbian worlds. Despite the persistence of various forms of representation repression directed against women who desired women, lesbian commercial establishments, where they flourished, gave the women who sought them out a new kind of public presence. In print and in groups. Publishing and organizing represents another way that women who loved women stepped out in public. In addition to the proliferation of public venues catering to lesbians, Berlin in the 1920s witnessed the emergence of lesbian publications in which the bars and clubs regularly advertised. Girlfriend, published from 1924 to 1933, directed its stories and articles to women described as quote unquote same sex loving, homosexual, homoerotic, or lesbian. See figure 27 for a cover from 1928. A censorship board described it as, quote, a harmless newsletter without literary ambitions, end quote, suggesting a non elite readership. The transnational aspect of lesbian culture is evident in the title of another periodical published in Berlin in the 1930s, Garçon, appearing from 1926 as um, Frauenliebe, Women Love, and from 1930 to 1932 under the new name, took the French word for boy and added a feminine ending. Garçon catered to a lesbian and male heterosexual transvestite audience. The term garçon type had come by the 1920s to apply to new or emancipated women who adopted a masculinized style of dress and behavior. Both periodicals featured stories, poems, and articles about homosexuality, as well as photographs and illustrations of a variety of lesbians, some cross-dressed, some in masculine feminine couples, some entirely feminine. As a censorship board described the content, quote, the stories and poems that make up most of the content glorify the love between women in a most effusive, sugary, sometimes passionate way, end quote. The magazine also featured personal ads that openly named lesbian desire, including both masculine, feminine, and feminine-feminine pairings. Quote, young woman seeks butch lesbian. Quote, lady, young, elegant, full-figured, seeks similar girlfriend, end quote. One woman remembered the importance and danger of reading Die Fraunden. Quote, I bought it where I had not known where I was not known, at a kiosk where nobody knew me. You felt as if you had a bomb in your pocket. I tried to read it wherever I could, on the toilet, where no one could disturb me. That's where I read it. End quote. The reach of these publications extended beyond Berlin. Women who lived in small cities and towns found them a lifeline. A reader from Karl Ruche, wrote to Garçon to say, quote, I cannot any longer do without this magazine, Garçon, end quote. And a contributor from Gorlitz explained that for, quote unquote, lonely women, the publication was, quote unquote, their best friend, a joy, and a greeting from the world that is also theirs, end quote. And that magazine reported on the developments across the German border as well. Frauenliebe took note of the successful founding of the Vienna Club Violetta in 1927. In 1931, Garçon ran an article titled A Voice from Switzerland, which asserted the importance of lesbian publications and organizations and bemoaned the lack of both in Switzerland, leading eventually to the formation of a lesbian group, Amicitia, later that year. Even before the Nazis came to power, such periodicals ran into legal troubles. Die Fraunden was shut down from 1928 to 1929 under a law designed to protect youth from quote-unquote trashy and obscene literature. So a new title, Single Women, appeared in its stead. When Frauenliebe ran afoul of the law, it changed its name to Garçon. Although the topic of homosexuality itself was not sufficient to declare a publication obscene, the ruling that shut down Frauenliebe in 1928 stated that the, quote, literary portion of the issue is worthless, end quote, and thus qualifies as trashy, and, quote, the way the issue accumulate advertisements that apparently serve to facilitate sexual relationships has to be seen as obscene in the sense of the law, end quote. The Berlin police targeted personal ads with sexual content, even answering ads themselves in order to entrap those who placed them. In addition, the debate about whether paragraph 175, the law against homosexuality that targeted only men, should be revised to include women continued during the Weyman years. Germany was not unique in outlawing same-sex-only acts between men. Austria, Sweden, Finland, and some Swiss cantons targeted women, but other countries did not. In addition to a flourishing commercial culture, Weimar Germany sported the first homosexual rights organizations, in which small number of women joined the predominantly male membership to fight for legal change and social acceptance. The two competing national organizations, the for whatever, League for Human Rights and German Friendship Association, sponsored separate women's clubs as well as, respectively, the periodicals Die Fraunden and Frauenliebe/Garçon. The women's group associated with the League for Human Rights and Die Fraunden offered an alternative to the bars in the form of readings, performances, and discussions, and the German Friendship Association/Garçon Circle featured Friday night dancing in a rented room and eventually regular balls, socials, dances, and lectures under the auspices of the two clubs, Violetta and Montbijou. Violetta, where the Lavender Song was sung, later switched its affiliation to the League of Human Rights, solidifying the parallel institution of the two groups. What differentiated them was class, erotic culture, and politics. The Garçon group was more elite, institutionalized gender differences between masculine and feminine women, exclude men, engaged less in politics. Die Fraunden tended to criticize women for attending only to pleasure. An article in 1929 urged women, quote, "Don't go to your entertainment whilst thousands of our sisters mourn their lives in gloomy despair." End quote. The two groups attacked each other publicly over the differences in membership, politics, and style. But what is remarkable is their level of organization and political activity unrivaled in the rest of the world at this time. Not until the 1950s in some places, and even later in others, can we find publications and organizations specifically for women who loved women. Ironically, perhaps, the longest lasting and most important gay publication in Europe in the mid-20th century owed a great deal to lesbians. Der Kreis emerged in Switzerland out of the series of predecessors, the first of which was published for a year in 1932 through a collaboration of women of Amicitia with a men's group. In 1933, Anne Vauch, known as Mamina, took over the editorship and financial responsibility for the paper, carrying the burden for many years and staying involved until her death in 1962. From 1943 to 1967, the paper with lesbian origins took on the name Der Kreis Le Cercle and continued as a decidedly gay male magazine. As other publications that were geared to gay men emerged across Europe and in the United States, in the context of a burgeoning movement that took the name Homophile, women, first in the United States and later in England, launched their own magazines. In 1956, the Daughters of Bilitis, the first U.S. lesbian organization, bravely started a newsletter, The Ladder, that lasted until 1972, eventually gathering a mailing list of almost 4,000 women. Le Garçon, before it, The Ladder, meant everything to subscribers across the country. Quote, "I have been receiving The Ladder and have been a member of the Daughters of Bilitis for more than a year now," end quote, wrote a New Jersey woman. Quote, "The day my coffee arrives, I sit down and read it from cover to cover," end quote. From California, another woman wrote, quote, "Like many another Ladder reader, I am always thoroughly delighted with your magazine. I wish I were blessed with financial means, talents, with writing abilities, or in some other way qualified to make more of a contribution to Daughters of Bilitis than I can. But as I am not, I join the ranks of those quiet followers who find you the light in the dark night and a warm fire for alien souls." End quote. Black playwright Lorraine Hensbury, an early subscriber and contributor, commented, "I'm glad as heck that you exist. You are obviously serious people, and I feel that women, without wishing to foster any strict separatists notions, homo or hetero, indeed have a need for their own publications and organizations. Women, like other oppressed groups of one kind or another, have particularly had to pay a price for the intellectual impoverishment that the second-class status imposed on us for centuries created and sustained. The first British lesbian periodical, Arena 3, emerged later than the latter and utilized the pages of Daughters magazine to spread word of its existence. Prompted by a hostile article about lesbians in a current affair journal, a lesbian journalist and author began to seek like-minded women to launch a journal, a dream that became a reality in 1964 under the auspices of the Minority Research Group founded for that purpose. By the magazine's demise in 1971, it had just 600 subscribers, with another 1,400 copies for sale at bookstores and newsstands. Like the latter, Arena 3 aimed to educate researchers, social workers, educators, and the media about homosexuality, and, as the name of the sponsoring organization suggests, to provide a non-patient population of lesbians for researchers. But it also served the purpose of connecting readers to one another and forging a collective identity as lesbian. As in the latter, readers expressed their delight at making contact with other lesbians. Since Arena 3 preceded the formation in Britain of an organization like the Daughters of Elitists in the United States, readers expressed hopes for the formation of a kind of social club. One reader thought something different from, quote, the kind of meeting places which are familiar in Paris, where lesbians only want to dance, chat, and smoke, end quote. As the reader's comment suggests, readers of Arena 3, along with the latter readers, tended to distinguish themselves from the butch femme women of the bar scene. Both periodicals featured debates over proper dress, respectability, offering sharp criticism of those who chose to wear men's clothing. With the emergence of lesbian feminism in the 1970s, which trumpeted a critique of men and masculine values, the butch became a despised symbol of an old-style lesbian life. Outside Britain and the United States, lesbian publications did not appear until the 1970s and 1980s. Yet that does not mean that women who desired women had no access to print. In Japan, the post-war years witnessed a kind of sexual revolution in reaction against the repression of wartime, and that included the emergence of trashy newspapers and magazines focusing on sex. An article published in 1948 discussed masculine tribads, toribado, and feminine saphists, saphuisto, the later likely to have been drawn into same-sex sexual activity in the schoolroom or factory dormitory. But what is most interesting is that some women readers wrote to such magazines making their desires public. In 1954, one reader requests, quote, beautiful maidens, please get in touch, end quote. And another woman complained, quote, it seems that you think that perverse love between women is extremely rare, but in fact, I think that it is very common, end quote. The next year, a woman lamented that there were no coffee shops or bars where young women could meet, as existed for quote-unquote male homos, and suggested that the magazine sponsor hiking trips or visits to the cinema and jazz clubs for women seeking other women. Although later Japanese sex publications offered representations of lesbians geared to male pornographic fantasy, and politicized lesbian feminists began to publish their own magazines in the 1970s, these voices from the 1950s should not be overlooked. That things were stirring in the post-war decade is also clear from the 1951 founding in Amsterdam of a transnational homophile organization, the International Committee for Sexual Equality. Yet this group remained heavily male, as is clear from its report on the lack of lesbian organization outside of the United States and Sweden. Women made up only 13% of the Dutch homophile organization, COC, Dutch Culture and Recreation Center. And according to one male member, women, quote, do not show any particular form of activity and hardly feel ashamed about this situation, end quote. A representative of a German group reported that women in some parts of the country were organized, in other places not, and that in Belgium, France, and Switzerland there was no women in the homophile groups. The first specifically lesbian organization, if a transitory one, was Alle for ein Klubben, all for one club, founded in Copenhagen in 1954, a year before the formation of the Daughters Abilitas. The U.S. organization, taking a name that harked back to the mythical lover of Sappho, formed in San Francisco in 1955 as a place safer than the bars to socialize and dance. From a secret lesbian social club beginning with four couples, it grew into a political organization determined to work along with the mostly male homophile groups, the Mattachine Society and One, to win legal and social acceptance for homosexuals. Lesbian organizations, of course, changed by the 1970s, with the birth of a more radical form of gay liberation. Lesbian publications, organizations, and cultural institutions flowered in different countries across the globe, sometimes rigidly separatist, giving rise to Erica Jong's portrait of the Amazons in Sappho's Leap, and sometimes working in conjunction with gay men. Women left the Dutch COC to found a radical feminist group, Lavender September, calling lesbianism the epitome of feminism and warning women not to sleep with their oppressors. The Colectivo de Lesbiennes de Barcelona, oh wait, okay, whatever. Barcelona Lesbian Collective, in 1978 issued a manifesto asserting, quote, "Our voice must be heard to keep watch over and reveal the common aspects of our reality as women and assert our differences as lesbians," end quote. On the other side of the divide, Atoba, an organization founded in Brazil after a young man died in a gay bashing incident, attracted lesbians and gay men from working class areas in Rio de Janeiro. In 1995, 31 different groups formed the Brazilian Association of Gays, Lesbians, and Transvestites. In the Czech Republic, SOHO, the Association for Organizations of Homosexual Citizens, founded in 1991, allots women a vice president slot. In the 1980s in South Africa, gay and lesbian organizations in both black and white communities aligned with the African National Congress's Freedom Charter, arguing for gay rights and as human rights, a principle recognized when the Constitution of 1996 became the first in the world to outlaw discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. In Mexico, in the 1970s, lesbian women found their interests ignored in the women's movement, leading Jan Maria Castro and Luz Maria Mardina to think they, quote, were the only Mexican lesbians in the entire country, end quote. They went on to found Lesbos, the first lesbian organization in Mexico. And when Nancy Cardenas, during the First World Conference for Women on the International Women's Year in 1975, set up a meeting between foreign and Mexican lesbians, she brought, quote, lesbians who felt they were trapped in women's bodies, those who were in their 60s and had not accepted gay militancy, and young girls of 20, end quote. Quote, I wanted them to see everything, end quote. As these few examples suggest, across the continents, women who desired women, spurred by both women's movements and a gay/lesbian movement, stepped out into public in a variety of ways. Whether women founded magazines or formed groups in the 1920s or 1950s or 1980s, that kind of activism made it possible for women to find others with similar desires and to know they were not alone. In different ways, in different places around the globe, love between women gained a new kind of public face in the 20th century. No one wondered if the butches and femmes in Ralph Martin's or the Gateways had sex with one another, as the experts did when pondering schoolgirls falling in love with their classmates in the early years of the 20th century. The schoolgirls themselves, from Buenos Aires to Italy to China to Japan, might have been rendered speechless by the cabarets and clubs of Berlin, Paris, Buffalo, Toronto, Montreal, and London. But it is worth noting that as late as the mid-20th century in England, girls' schools were still full of raves and pashes, and those sometimes still seemed as a harmless part of girlish development and only sometimes a sign of lesbianism. If Havelock Ellis and Julien Chevalier and Otsuko Shinzo associated feminism with lesbianism, it is hard to imagine what the likes of Hiratsuko Raicho or Lu Yin or Anna Howard Shaw or Anita Aussprung would have made of the Berlin Garçon or the butch femme couple of the gateways. Natalie Barney did experience the commercialized arena of lesbian bars in Paris, but found her own world in which the public took part only through reading or viewing the creations of her circle more enchanting. By the second half of the 20th century, it was not only elite literary productions such as those that flowed out of Barney's circle that publicized the world of lesbian love. Following Die Freunden and Gaston, the latter and Arena 3, and then other publications and organizations lesb- affirmed lesbian visibility in new ways. How important visibility how important visibility could be in is suggested by the statement of an Indian state minister determined to censor the film Fire. Quote, through les Quote, though lesbianism is one of the older forms of sexual activity, these things are not in the open. People do not know about it, so we must make sure that such films do not insult, read, inform the public. End quote. Yet, it is important to remember that being in the public eye or going out in public was not just one way that women who loved women lived their lives in the 20th century. Whether there were no salons or clubs, where there were no salons or clubs, women still managed to find one another. Two Canadian women, Frida Fraser and Edith Budd Bickerton Williams, formed an intimate relationship as university students in the 1910s and left a legacy of passionate letters. They recognized other women with emotional ties but carefully guarded the nature of their relationship in public. In Deadwood, South Dakota in the 1920s and 1930s, Julia Boyer Reinstein, a teacher, had affairs with women and eventually settled down in a committed relationship. Her parents knew about her sexuality, and she suspected that people gossiped, but as long as she kept her intimate life private and respectable, she was not named a lesbian. In rural Finland in the 1950s, 32 women faced prosecution for, quote, with another person of the same sex fornication, end quote, including a mother of 4 children, a group of religious women running an orphanage, a housekeeper and her employer, and the employer's sister and her dairy farming trainee. Persistent male conceptions are clear in the question posed by the police. Was money involved? Were devices used? Who was on top? Who was active? Who was passive? Yet, even if women did not know how to find others with desires in private places, the possibility of a public world may have been alluring to women living in different circumstances. Commercial establishments catering to lesbians did not emerge outside of the industrialized Western world until after the 1970s, but just as English women traveled to Paris in the 1920s, elite women from countries without a lesbian public culture could find it elsewhere. One Gateway's regular told of meeting, quote, 2 beautiful ladies, professional women from Persia. They came to London each year and spent time at the Gateways. Then they'd return to their husbands and children, end quote. The existence of public spaces changed the lives of the women who frequented them, and perhaps they also had an impact in entirely different places where women who loved women found other ways to live their lives. The economic, political, and social development that made a public lesbian life possible included the emergence of educational institutions for women, increasing employment opportunities, the rise of commercialized entertainment in urban areas, and the development of publications or organizations. All these developments came together in places such as Weimar, Berlin, Greenwich Village, and Harlem in the 1920s, and in smaller cities in the industrialized world in the 1950s and 1960s. But even one of these developments, the emergence of girls' schools, for example, could facilitate public awareness of and possibilities for the love of women, as we see in the cases of Japan and China. What these new public worlds made visible was the potential of women's independence from male control, long feared and increasingly a reality. Oh my god, that was really long.